So on page 137 of the Keys to Close Reading, we have the Archetypes section. Archetypes are patterns that show up in literature over and over and over again, about whose meaning we collectively agree. So they are deeply profound symbols or characters or storylines that we recognize over and over again. And they are patterns that we can teach kids to see and respond to. And kids feel really empowered when they can see it for themselves. So there are 3 sections in the archetype section: the archetypal characters section, the hero's journey, and archetypal symbols. And in this video, I'm going to just briefly go through all of them. Keep in mind that the Keys to Close Reading is a handbook for students. This book looks geared towards children because it is. So this is something that you could actually give to kids in, any classroom, literally 4th to 12th grade, or even college. So the first page explains what an archetype is. There's a little aside about an orphan character being a very common archetype, especially in young children's literature. An orphan doesn't have to be a literal orphan. They don't have to have necessarily lost parents or a parent, but the parent is, for whatever reason during the story, unavailable to assist the child. So let's take a look at some other types of archetypal characters. The orphan we just talked about. The warrior is usually often our main character. Not always, but a lot of the times they are fighting to accomplish something, to do something. It's not necessarily an actual physical fight. It might just be a challenge or an undertaking or a lesson that needs to be learned, something. A pilgrim, and again, these archetypes, they overlap. So you can be a warrior and a pilgrim and an orphan. So there are many different ways that you can look at a character. A pilgrim is someone traveling outside of their familiar environment. So think of the kids in Narnia, for example. The villain, obviously, or the antagonist, is anyone who is blocking our main character from trying to, anyone or anything who's trying to block the character from accomplishing what they need to accomplish. Sage teacher shows up so often, is usually someone who is a mentor to the main character. And the sage teacher dies frequently in stories so that the hero can come into his or her full power. Sometimes they just step aside, like the giver. The guy didn't die, but he kind of took a really major backseat. But if you think of Star Wars or Harry Potter, sage teacher dies so that the hero can come into his power. Okay, so we have the knight champion. Now, the knight champion is like the warrior, but instead of the challenge being his or her own challenge, they have taken on a challenge for someone else who is not capable of doing that. And that person is the victim/damsel in distress. Now, this person does not have to be male, and this person does not have to be female. There are plenty of male damsels in distress in stories, and there are plenty of female knight champions. So gender or whatever gender, it doesn't matter. It's just an archetype. So the companion or sidekick, think Han Solo, Princess Leia, Hermione, Ron in Harry Potter, just the friends who accompany the hero on whatever their journey is. Okay. The minion is someone who is working for the villain. Sometimes minions are disguised as good guys, so we think that sometimes they're disguised as the companion sidekick, so we think that, oh, this person's a friend, and then suddenly at the end our hero finds that, oh my goodness, this person has been the one that's working against me all the time. Hapless foil, almost always funny. Think Hagrid. Think Hagrid, particularly in the first Harry Potter, where he kept telling them stuff about where the Sorcerer's Stone was hidden and things about the dog that then he would go, I shouldn't have said that. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said that. So he's a hapless foil. The vixen temptress, again, does not have to be female. It's usually someone who is beautiful on the outside and not very nice on the inside. Often, the star quarterback or cheerleader or something that our person has a crush on from afar and thinks it would be so great, and then it turns out that they, once they get to know them, they're not very nice. The good mother, think, fairy godmother in Cinderella, very supportive, and does not have to be a literal mother, just someone who is fulfilling that nurturing role. A devouring mother, think the stepmother in Cinderella, someone who is making it really difficult or creating a difficult environment for our hero. A powerful father, often heroic, often absent. Just think Poseidon in Percy Jackson. There's a powerful father for you, but he's never around, but he's very powerful. Or a shadow father. Think maybe Darth Vader there. He's the opposite of the powerful father. The love interest, of course, often thwarted by whatever is happening in the story. And sometimes it happens and sometimes it doesn't. And often, especially like in a rom-com, you'll see this, the love interest, and there's reasons why they can't get together, and then finally they figure it out in the end. The unrequited love can often go with the vixen temptress, because our hero is loving them from afar and they do not return the affection. And sometimes it's because that person is not really the right person, or maybe sometimes it's because they just haven't noticed our hero yet. So we don't, it can go either way. You can see different types of heroes. The hero as warrior, the hero as lover. There's Romeo. The hero is a scapegoat. He is taking the blame for something he didn't do. The transcendent hero, the hero of tragedy, whose fatal flaw brings about his downfall, but not without achieving some kind of transforming realization or wisdom, right? And so often they'll die at the end, but some big transcendent thing has happened, some insight has happened as a result of their death. A romantic or gothic hero, think brooding vampire. And like that guy Edward in Twilight. The apocalyptic hero often is in a situation where it's a dystopian future. The Hunger Games, Katniss is a perfect example. And the anti-hero is, think Homer Simpson. Just, we like him, but why? There are just a couple more. The defiant anti-hero is Anakin Skywalker, is absolutely the epitome of that. They are opposing society at large, and they oppose the idea of heroism or goodness, and sometimes tempted away. But there's like maybe a kernel of good in them, but they've just taken the wrong path. The unbalanced hero, think Hamlet, think One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. They either do have or they have to pretend to have some kind of mental illness. The guy that Mel Gibson played in, he was that detective that was crazy with Danny Glover. I can't remember the name of it, but the denied hero, is a protagonist whose status or differentness makes heroism possible. Maybe somebody who, there are a couple of lovely stories written from the point of view of students with autism or children with autism, young people with autism who are standing on the outside looking in. And then, of course, the superhero, which Goes without saying. They're a superhero. So that is all the types of archetypal characters. The next archetypal idea is the hero's journey. It is an archetypal storyline, and we see it almost universally in young adult literature. Not that writers really think of themselves as writing the hero's journey. They don't, but because it is just such a profound part of our collective imagination and collective unconscious, as Carl Jung would say, writers just tap into it. So the idea of a hero's journey is that we have a hero, our main character, and they are dealing with two parts of themselves. One is sort of a gift. We call it the special weapon. It may be just the capacity to love, or like Luke Skywalker, the ability to use the Force, but also they don't use it very well. And one of the reasons they don't use it very well is because they're also dealing with some kind of internal flaw, like a bad temper, or just impatience, or low self-esteem, something like that. Something that they are going to have to go through a whole series of adventures in order to learn more about themselves and in order to overcome that flaw so that they can successfully use their gift. So, the way it works, and we've all heard of the plot diagram. Now, a word about the plot diagram. Normally, it looks like, with the point right here in the middle, which is very silly because the climax never happens in the middle of the story. That's just silly. It happens much closer to the end of the story. But this yellow marks the plot diagram. There's the exposition, there's the rising action, the climbing, the climax, the falling action, and the resolution. And this is the hero's journey mirrored alongside it, which there are 6 stages, and we will talk about each of the stages and then come back and look at this again now that we've looked at all the stages. Okay. So the initiation is when the hero crosses a threshold of some kind and steps into a new world. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean a physical threshold. It could just be a threshold in your mind, like the hero has just assented. I am going to take this on, I'm going to do this, and then it's like a shifting of perspective or something. It could be something as subtle as that, or it could be like, I am taking off to go look at a new planet, or, it just depends on the actual story. But it is kind of the first step into what the journey is. Now, lots of things can happen during the initiation and often do. One of the things that generally tends to happen, although not always, is that they meet the villain in some shape or form. Maybe we don't know it's the villain yet, but often we will meet the villain. We often also meet the sage teacher at that point, although sometimes the sage teacher doesn't come until later. And then usually we get some inkling of what the character's special weapon is. It can, again, be an object. Often it is an ability, though. So the hero is not good at using it. But a lot happens during the initiation. And as I said, we often meet the villain as well. Now, remember, the villain does not have to be a person. The villain can be nature, like in Hatchet, or the villain can be an illness of some kind. This is a great book called Drums, Girls, and Dangerous Pie, where the villain is cancer. Or the villain can be some part of yourself, something. It's man versus nature, man versus self. Whatever the versus is that's what the villain is. So we then step on to the actual road of trials. And the road of trials is a series of just exactly what it says: trials, adventures, tests, challenges, things that happen to the hero, obstacles that the hero must overcome. Things that the hero has to do, and each time they do it, and they get over an obstacle, they gain some new little piece of understanding or clarity that helps them to proceed forward. Sometimes they stumble, They always get up. They're often helped along by their trusty sidekicks or sidekick. And there's also a trope where, you have a little romantic thing between the two sidekicks, as we saw in Harry Potter and Star Wars. The two sidekicks fell for each other. And then the hero goes along until right before the climax of the story, where we get to the low point, called the innermost cave. Interestingly, authors know, they all know that they have to bring their character to a low point. And then how do they get their character out of the low point? That's what writers do. But what's really cool is that so many of them will put the low point somewhere dark or raining, or sometimes an actual cave. Luke was literally in a cave, and he had to face himself, and he actually had to face himself, and he had to face Darth Vader. So there is, and like Harry in the Dark Forest, where he, gets zapped by Voldemort, and then he goes into that other world for a little bit, and he has to, he has dealt with that Voldemort part of himself. So this is where the hero confronts that weakness, that flaw that was identified early in the story during the departure or the initiation. That's where we find where the flaw is. And that this is where they confront it. And it is not until they confront this flaw and overcome it that the hero is able to then leave the innermost cave and be in the full hero's power that is necessary to wield the special weapon, whatever that special weapon is. So there's a wonderful story about a slave girl in the American Revolution whose special weapon is that she can read and write, and nobody knows it, because slaves weren't allowed to do that. And she eventually uses that power to win her freedom. So, but she can't do it until she believes in herself. She has to go through the innermost cave, and which in this case is a potato bin. So the author put her someplace dark. The authors will often do it. Watch Disney. They're always somewhere dark. Or any young adult, anything. It's always somewhere dark. Or it's a rainstorm. Or it's a dark forest. Or it's a cave. Or it's a basement. So when they emerge, they are in full hero's power, and they are ready to go and do what? Face the villain. The villain is what the hero confronts at the climax of the story. And now in his or her full power, the hero faces the villain or the antagonist and can wield the special weapon and use it to defeat the villain, or in the case of the transcendent hero, to be sacrificed and transcend, have a moment of transcendence. But that doesn't happen as often in young children's stories. And the last stage is the return and reintegration, which in the plot mountain is, the falling action and resolution. So the hero goes back or doesn't go back. A lot of times they do go back in young children's stories. They go back to the story, the place where they originally started. Only everything is different because they are different, because of what they have experienced. There is no point in telling any kind of a story unless it's to demonstrate how a character has been changed by it. If a character has learned nothing, changed nothing, it's not as interesting. So the hero has grown and changed. They come back and they are different. And it is understood that their lives will be different, or the world will be different, or something will be different now. So let's go back to where we were at the beginning to look at how the 6 stages of the hero's journey work together with the plot mountain that we generally see. I like to think of the plot mountain as stuff that happens external to the hero, and the hero's journey is the internal journey. Even though things happen to the hero, this is what they learn, how they change, how they grow. So the departure is right here between, we have the exposition, which is like This is how everything starts. This is what the world looks like before anything happens. And then the departure kind of comes in here right at then some people would add conflict here, but yes, the departure happens right when the conflict is introduced. And then the initiation is sort of the beginning of the road of trials, and then all these jagged ups and downs are meant to show that the road of trials, which is not always a straight shot to the top. The innermost cave, the low point, right before the climax, which is the same for both, and then the return and reintegration happens more during the resolution and the falling action. I guess maybe the return is the falling action and the reintegration is the resolution. So that's how the two of them work together. So next up is symbols, and symbols are, again, patterns. All of this is about patterns that we see in literature and teaching students to see these patterns. Symbols fall into two categories. They can be archetypal, which means that they kind of have the same meaning no matter where you're reading them. In whatever story you're reading them, they always kind of have the same meaning. Or they can be more of a local symbol, something that the author puts in a particular story that only has meaning and significance within the confines of that story. But right now we're talking about archetypal symbols. So there are a bunch. We start with animals. There are often animals, especially in kids' stories, and usually a lot of animals will have qualities that we think of. Like when we think of a bird, we think of freedom, or when we think of a dog, we think of loyalty, or when we think of a lion, we think of courage and bravery. So the animals in a given story will usually represent whatever quality is associated with them. Next up is the dark, and it is one of many archetypal symbols that has a dual meaning. Often archetypal symbols will have two meanings, depending on how it's being used. Often the dark represents unknown, ignorance, death, bad things. But it can also represent the beginnings of growth. I mean, a baby in the womb is in the dark, and it is gestating and growing and preparing. So sometimes we need to be down in the dark before we can, grow up into the light, like a little seedling under the earth. So there are definitely two sides to something like the dark. Fire, again, has two sides. It can be knowledge, light, warmth, rebirth, but it can also be angry. It can be destructive. So it just depends on how it is being used. Ice, ignorance, darkness, sterility, death, and being emotionally stuck. Ice generally doesn't have good connotations, but, occasionally, the Snow Queen, occasionally, sometimes, but not usually. The fog, uncertainty, confusion, being lost. If a character is in the fog, that is what the author is trying to, or mist or something, the author is trying to convey unknown, mysteriousness, uncertainty, being lost. Landforms, again, like animals, have sort of meanings associated with them. A mountain is majestic, a marsh is got some nasty connotations, illness, evil, something like that. Light, usually hope, life renewal, intellectual illumination. There's generally not a downside to light. Roses, all the time. And again, another dual thing, which songwriters write about all the time. The rose smells beautiful, but it has thorns. So that duality is there with roses. Seasons. There is often a cyclical nature to something that a character is experiencing, or to a hero's journey. It is the cycle of life, birth, life, waning, death, and then rebirth again. So there's often that idea imbued in stories. The special weapon. Now, again, that's going to change for every character that you see, but the idea is that it is something that the hero always has. And they have it, they don't know what to do with it at the beginning, and then they become able to wield it to overcome at the end of the story. Stars, hope, longing, spiritual, eternity, wisdom, generally all positive. The sun and the moon are often the masculine and feminine, sun being the masculine principle and the moon being the female principle. The sun is heat, strength, light, and the moon is kind of feminine and mysterious and intuitive and psychic and deep. So it just depends on how they're being used. But if you see a moon or a sun or something and the author's talking about it, we're being archetypal. Trees, of course, growth, knowledge, wisdom, nature, protection. Often if there's a wasteland or like an apocalyptic hero is coming into a situation where there's been a lot of damage, we'll get descriptions of, these ravaged trees, and it represents kind of the withering of the society, right? Water, everywhere. People dream about water all the time. I mean, water is everywhere. Look for characters from everything from, the snow, which is a form of water, and to the beach, or a bathtub, or a fountain, or being in the rain. Anytime there's water, it's because we're dealing with emotion and deeper truths that lie beneath the surface. There are also a lot of archetypal colors, and most colors have dual meanings. So red, the positive is passion, energy, love. The negative is blood, death, sacrifice. Green, the positive is growth, hope, fertility. The negative is jealousy, envy, illness. The positive about blue is security, tranquility, spiritual purity, wisdom, and water, too. Negative, sadness, depression, the blues, singing the blues. And blue is sometimes thought of as a cold color, but it does scientifically, vibrationally, vibrate at a higher frequency than the red spectrum. Black, the positive can be that time before birth that we talked about, and then the negative, obviously, darkness, chaos, evil, all that. The gray can have a positive for elderly and wisdom, but also depression and purgatory and blah. Brown, the positive is the earth, the richness. The negative is dirt, poverty. White, positive, light, purity, and negative is death and horror. So yellow, the positive is enlightenment, and the negative is cowardice and deceit. And purple is royalty. It's the highest vibrational frequency, ultraviolet. Power, royalty, luxury, ambition, extravagance. It can be also associated with wisdom and dignity and magic. The orange is often associated with warmth, the sun, and fire. So there are also some numbers that are thought of as archetypal. I just put a few here, the big ones. 3, light, spiritual awareness, the unity of the, there's a reference to the Holy Trinity in Christian religion, and the male principle. 4 is associated with the circle, life cycle, 4 seasons, the female principle, earth, and natural elements. And 7 is a very powerful symbol because it is 3 and 4 put together. So it has all of the good stuff from both of those numbers, which is why we see it so very often in so many different literary venues. Okay, so that's the archetypal trifecta, archetypal characters, the hero's journey, and archetypal symbols. Once you start looking for them, you cannot stop seeing them. And once you teach kids how to look for them, they start to have much more meaningful and interesting and analytical and critical thinking kinds of responses to what they're reading.